start the record and hit continue so we can go. All right, so what was I saying? I think the illustrations that she shared with us a little bit earlier are a good starting point for talking about judges, right? Historically, much like you saw in the first photo, judges were thought to occupy the highest seat in any given courtroom. And there's a very specific reason for that. In the United States, we have an adversarial system where you expect the dueling parties to battle it out, right? In a criminal case, that's the prosecution and defense. In a civil case, the plaintiff and the respondent or the defendant. And it goes up along, I think, the lines of every aspect of our legal system. And above that fray, right, above that scrum was supposed to sit an individual who would apply the law impartially, fairly, equitably, right? That's the idea, that's the concept behind the position and role of judge in an adversarial system. Now, I think you would struggle to find a large number of individuals who would agree that that's how it works in practice, right? Even if they don't necessarily have any qualms with the way the system works, I think you would still struggle to find people who say, you know what, judges are always fair. Judges are always impartial. The rulings they hand down are always equitable. And some of that is systemic. Some of that is individual personalities of a particular judge, right? Because the unfortunate aspect of the law is that it's not a science, right? It's not 2 + 2 = 4. It's not, there is cause and effect, not really. It's far more of an art. And in the application of that art, people make mistakes all the time and people do things that often hurt other people, and judges are not immune to that either. And I think recognizing that is really important to recognizing what the appropriate role, I think, of a judge or the judiciary is. So before you even get to that point, how does someone become a judge? It's honestly not very difficult, at least not on the front end. The idea behind being a judge in this country is that you have you've shown an ability to appreciate different aspects of the law. You've gotten a certain number of years of practice, actual practice under your belt, and that you're able generally to see both sides of a particular issue and to respond to seeing both sides of a particular issue fairly, right? That's generally the rule of being a judge, is that you have to be impartial. For the most part, you're not an advocate. And so in Minnesota specifically, there are 2 ways to become a judge. Either you can be appointed by the selection, effectively appointed by the governor, because it's ultimately the governor's role to appoint a judge, or you're going to be elected. This has a lot to do, when we'll talk a little bit later, about how judges are held accountable, because you're either held accountable as a judge by your peers, or you're held accountable by the ballot box. Neither mechanism works very well, kind of as a spoiler, but those are the 2 ways you become a judge, right? If you do make it to that point in your career or your life where you are appointed or you're voted into a judicial position, you're going to be working alongside other members of the judiciary in a particular judicial district. If you are in Hennepin County, it's the 4th Judicial District, for example. If you're in Ramsey County or St. Paul, it's the 2nd Judicial District. And those are kind of the 2 biggest judicial districts in the state, the most populous judicial district, I should say. You are going to be responsible as a judge for presiding not over just criminal cases, but any kind of legal case that comes into the system. And yes, in some of the bigger counties, so in Hennepin and Ramsey County, there is a delineation. So a judge may have a criminal calendar, or they may have a juvenile calendar, or they may have a family calendar, and they'll practice primarily in those distinct divisions. If you go to other parts of the state though, so if you go up to St. Louis County, if you go out to like Coachella County, which is just kind of west and north of St. Louis County and other places like that, you're going to be in judicial districts where you may have 4 judges total. And those 4 judges are going to see and hear everything that goes on in their single courthouse, right? So it really depends on where you are, what your caseload would look like. The expectation of a judge is that they're not specialists, right? No one expects a judge to be a specialist in criminal work. No one expects a judge to be a specialist in family law or CHIPS cases. The idea is that you're a generalist, that you have a general appreciation of the law and an ability to rule on issues of law even on issues of law that you may not necessarily be comfortable or have very much knowledge of. You're expected to learn, right? And that's at the very base end. That's before we start talking about interacting with attorneys. It's before we start talking about interacting with criminal defendants, with the defendants in civil cases, with hostile parties in a divorce case. The responsibility of a judge requires an individual, I think, supposedly, to know the law generally, right? But it is still a people kind of profession. It's a people business. And so working with your colleagues on the bench, working with the individuals who come into your courtroom, working with your staff, working with the interns and the clerks that you're supervising, that's all a very important part of what the job of a judge looks like. Because at the end of the day, they're administrators as well, right? They run a courtroom, they employ staff. And I think the best judges will also take that particular kind of appreciation and understand that they're welcoming members of the community into a courtroom. And they're responsible for how someone feels when they walk through those doors, when they are otherwise, I think, panicking or they're stressed out because they're looking at being sentenced to prison. They're panicking or they're stressed out because maybe, the question that's going to be answered today in court is whether or not they get to see their child, right, in a custody dispute. And I think the best judges are cognizant of that fact, and they're aware of the idea that it's their responsibility and their job really to make every individual who steps into their courtroom comfortable, even if they may necessarily leave the courtroom not liking what the judge did, right? And so you have a lot of judges, I think, who appreciate that, and you have judges who don't. You have judges who see their roles simply as kind of that neutral referee, the arbiter of, you know what, you guys tell me how you would like the law applied, and I will then apply the law, and that's the end of my job, right? And that's certainly one way to go about doing it. And I think a lot of, especially older judges, will tell you that's exactly their job and there's nothing else to it. But I think if you spoke to, especially some judges in maybe Hennepin County or Ramsey County, where I think they have a more holistic view of the work that they do and the impact that they have on people, you will hear judges who currently sit on the bench say that part of their role is to not just reflect the expectations of the community that elected them or that helped appoint them, but also to be able to say to someone who's sitting in front of them, who's being sentenced, for example, or being given an adverse order or opinion, that, listen, you were heard, your opinion was valued, your words mattered, and I may be ruling against you now. I may be doing something you're not going to like, but I'm doing so because there is a certain way to apply the law, and it's not because you're a bad person, right? And I think there are some judges now in both Hennepin and Ramsey County, and those are the counties I practice in the most, who I think would see that as a very specific and intentional role of the modern judge, especially a judge in a diverse community in kind of 2021, the United States of America. I should also say, I'm not entirely sure if I'm supposed to be taking questions, Malika or Emmanuel, or if I'm just supposed to kind of vent. I don't know what the policy for that is. But what I would say is if someone has a question, especially if you're going then into a breakout room to try and inform some kind of conversation, because I won't be in the breakout rooms. Actually, I have another meeting at 6 I need to run to. Feel free to either throw your question in the chat or, I would say maybe just throw your question in the chat, and I'll see what I can do about getting to them and answering them so that you guys have as much information as humanly possible and that you're getting information that is actually relevant to you, that you care about, okay? One of the questions I was asked in preparation for this was, how does a judge make their decision? And that's an excellent question because I think it depends on the person, right? I think the idea behind it, though, is that, and I alluded to this earlier, is that you have an adversarial system in the United States. And so you have advocates on both sides of a particular issue whose job and whose role it is to tell a judge, we believe you should apply the law in this way. We believe you should apply the law, and that allows my client to be sentenced to probation. On the other side, you have probation, maybe a prosecutor saying, we believe you should apply the law, and this individual should be sent to prison for 30 years, right? If you think about Derek Chauvin and the sentencing that most people, I think, would have had access to a couple of weeks ago, most people would have watched, right? You had a defense attorney saying, probation, please. And you had a prosecutor saying, What were they asking? They were asking for 30 years. Judge Cahill at the end of the day said, I hear what you're both saying. I'm going to do, I think it was 22. I think that's what it was, right? And so Judge Cahill was reflecting what is otherwise the traditional role of a judge, which is to say the advocates are telling me how the law should work, but it's ultimately my decision as the judge to explain to everyone involved what the law actually says. Now, that's a tremendous power, right? And while judges are not meant to be fact finders per se, they're not necessarily meant to involve themselves in the development of facts of a case, in the presentation of facts of a case, because they are in fact interpreting the law and applying the law. By the consequence of that, they are determining how a case comes in, what facts are presented to a jury, what facts can even be heard by anyone in the case, right? And that's something that is a tremendous power. It's why the judges, I think, sit in that highest chair in the courtroom, as it were. I see a question in the chat from Linda. And the question, let's see here, is what are judges supposed to do if police officers are lying? That you've been listening to Mary Moriarty, who's fantastic, with respect to police brutality and police misconduct, and that police officers lie in police reports. Why don't judges do something? I think the easy and simple question to that is that judges do have the power to do something, right? A judicial order could easily be written from a judge that says, this officer testified in my courtroom. I found their story to be incredible. I found them to be untrustworthy. And I am dismissing this case, or I am prohibiting the use of the evidence that they were able to develop because of that. Oftentimes, and I want to say 99.9% of the times, most judges will be incredibly reluctant to write words like that, to truly admonish law enforcement, at least in public, right? And the reason for that is because they're incredibly deferential. They're deferential because most judges, and I'm going to speak specifically about Minnesota now, most judges in the state are former prosecutors. They're individuals who would have worked alongside law enforcement officers in a very collegial kind of relationship, who have now become judges and are going to extend the same deference they would have ordinarily extended to those officers when they were city attorneys or when they were county attorneys. On the flip side of that, you have a number of current judges who are former, or let's say they're defense attorneys or they're former public defenders who don't want to appear biased to defendants in criminal cases. And so they are deferential to law enforcement for different reasons, but with the same result. What will instead happen, instead of calling out law enforcement or a police officer or someone specific in public, you will largely see a lot of those conversations happening behind closed doors, right? So instead of calling out a law enforcement officer on the record in a document that's public or in an oral argument, for example, a judge will go back and talk to the prosecutor and say, you may want to think twice about putting that officer on the stand again, and just leave it at that. Right? And so there's no then public admonishment of an individual. There is instead that private admonishment, and really then the judge leaves it up to the prosecutor or to some other entity to kind of follow through with some kind of effective punishment or to curtail somebody, right? And I'm seeing a question in the chat from Alana. It is absolutely true that judges interpret the law. They interpret the law in applying the law. Right? There's no way to get around that. And as you go up the judicial level, so you go from a district court judge to an appellate court judge to a Supreme Court justice, the dispute often between the different levels of the judiciary is on interpretations of law, right? Because they're generally not going to dispute facts. They're not going to try to reinterpret the facts of a case, but the disputes will often are going to involve interpretations of the law. Similarly, you can kind of go back to what happened with Mohammed Noor, right, with respect to the question of the third-degree murder, where there was an interpretation of the law at the district court level that said this is okay, at the appellate court level where they said that's not okay, and then at the Supreme Court level where it was okay, right? There were disagreements as to the interpretation of law, and because judges get to apply the law, their interpretation is incredibly important. Linnea, I see your question as well. How do judges change, or are they facially neutral when speaking with parties behind closed doors versus in a public courtroom? I think so let me answer this question this way. Judges are not super beings or superheroes or anything to that extent, right? They are people. And just like, how you talk to your friends may be different than how you talk to people who are maybe, acquaintances versus people maybe you just don't like. Judges are going to do the same thing, right? And a lot of it comes, to be perfectly honest with you, a lot of that comes down to personalities, right? There are attorneys in my office who will tell you they cannot get along with some judges on the Hennepin County bench. And those are some judges that I get along with pretty well, right? And it's just a personality issue, you know? And so to the extent that like you will have judges and you recognize that judges are people too, and especially in a situation in law where the legal community is small, right? You have judges who they may have been working with some of the individuals who are now practicing in front of them 2 weeks ago. And now they're in their chambers and they're talking, right? Similarly, they may be in a position where, they may have tried a case against someone 2 years ago. It was a terrible experience for everyone involved. And now they're a judge and that person is in their chambers and they're talking to them and there's built up animosity from that, right? Those things all happen. And I think to pretend otherwise would be to do a disservice both to yourself and your client, but also to the judge, because everyone is a person, right? We have this expectation that judges rise above it, or at least that's sometimes a public perception. I don't know how true in reality that is. And it's something that you have to work around. It is something sometimes you can use as a tool, especially as a defense attorney, but it's something you definitely have to be cognizant of, right? Linda had a question about...
With just 3 minutes left, I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about how judges are held accountable. And specifically, you have an audience of people here who are interested in like legal system transformation and how they can get involved with that. So how can community, also hold judges accountable as well?
It's difficult for the community to hold judges accountable generally, especially in a situation where most community members are not very aware of the types of power judges can wield, and kind of the various different ways, right? So judges are not just in court, but they're on judicial committees, right? They are on sentencing commissions. They're talking to legislators. And for the most part, when you have the judicial elections, you have the ballot, people are looking at it. Most people aren't turning over the ballot to get to judicial nominations, right? They're not actually voting for judges because they don't know who the people are. And so there is a significant lack of information out there, not just about the role of judges, but about who judges are and who these people are who are making so many important decisions that affect so many different people. And so I think the easiest ways for people to get involved, for people to really start to hold judges accountable, is to actually start caring about who your judges are. And when you get the ballot, to really figure out who is it that I want to vote for, and don't be afraid to vote for someone who's not the incumbent, right? Just because someone isn't currently a sitting judge doesn't mean that they wouldn't be an excellent judge, and that they may not necessarily be a better judge than the person who's currently holding that seat. Outside of that, though, judges are generally held accountable by their peers, right? So as a judge, there's oftentimes a chief judge who's going to be kind of the lead person in a particular judicial district. That chief judge is going to be responsible for holding their fellow judges and the people that work under them accountable. And having some kind of public relationship with the chief judge is going to be an excellent way to actually hold a judge accountable. It's a whole lot easier to do that in smaller districts. In Hennepin County, for example, 60 plus judges, a lot more difficult, right? Ramsey County, you've got, I think, 22 judges, a lot more difficult. You go to some other parts of the state, 4, 5, 6 judges, it's a lot easier to hold the judges accountable, if only because most people in the community then know who they are, right? But outside of those two real mechanisms, it's really, really, really difficult to hold a judge accountable because the system itself is designed to be archaic, arcane, and not very transparent, right? I would bet a certain amount of money that most people here can't name all the judges in their district, and I'm pretty sure I'd win that bet. And I think there's a reason for that, despite the fact that the information is like on the Minnesota court's website. But judges aren't encouraged to be in the community. They aren't encouraged to be a part of their communities. They aren't necessarily encouraged to be transparent about the work they're doing. And that lack of transparency, I think, is by design in order to keep people in positions of power. And so holding people accountable runs anathema to that. It's very difficult then to say, I'm going to hold this particular judge accountable when you have no idea what they're doing, right? I see Kate had a question about a good resource to look for judges' decisions. There is none. The vast majority of decisions made by judges, both in civil and criminal courts, are going to be oral decisions that don't require a written order. Otherwise, any written order in a public case is going to be accessible through Minnesota courts, but you'd have to know the specific case. You would likely have to know when the order was filed or issued so that you could pull a copy of it. There's no good resource for it, unfortunately. And so Malika, I think that gets us to 601. So.
Yep. So I know you have a meeting to get to, Andrew. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks for fielding these awesome questions that we got from the audience. So we'll let you go, and I'll turn it over to Malika to kind of get us started with some deep breaths and then go over the community guidelines.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew.